Late one fog-bound night, a man goes in search of a book to help him sleep. He finds one he doesn't remember. Did he inherit it? It has no title, no author. It's written in Latin in an unknown but legible hand, and once he begins to read it, he can't stop returning to it each night. He was a happy family man, a little bored, but happy. So what is he now? Margaret Irwin's The Book first appeared in the London Mercury in 1930. Join me, Tony Walker, narrator of the Classic Ghost Stories podcast, for this week's story, The Book by Margaret Irwin.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked drawer today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?
The Book by Margaret Irwin. On a foggy night in November, Mr. Corbett, having guessed the murder by the third chapter of his detective story, arose in disappointment from his bed and went downstairs in search of something more satisfactory to send him to sleep. The fog had crept through the closed and curtained windows of the dining room and hung thick on the air in a silence that seemed as heavy and breathless as the fog. The atmosphere was more choking than in his room and very chill, although the remains of a large fire still burned in the grate. The dining room bookcase was the only considerable one in the house, and held a careless, unselected collection to suit all the tastes of the household, together with a few dull and obscure theological books that had been left over from the sale of a learned uncle's library. Cheap red novels, bought on railway stalls by Mrs. Corbett, who thought a journey the only time to read, were thrust in like pert, undersized intruders among the respectable 19th century works of culture, chastely bound in dark blue or green, which Mr. Corbett had considered the right thing to buy during his Oxford days. Beside these, there swaggered the children's large, gaily bound storybooks and collection of fairy tales in every colour. From among this neat, new cloth-bound crowd, there towered here and there a musty sepulchre of learning, brown with the colour of dust rather than leather, with no trace of gilded letters, however faded on its crumbling back, to tell what lay inside. A few of these moribund survivors from the Dean's library were inhospitably fastened with rusty clasps. All remained closed and appeared impenetrable, their blank, forbidding backs uplifted above their frivolous surroundings with the air of scorn that belongs to a private and concealed knowledge. For only the worm of corruption now bored his way through their evil-smelling pages. It was an unusual flight of fancy for Mr. Corbett to imagine that the vaporous and fog-ridden air that seemed to hang more thickly about the bookcase was like a dank and poisonous breath exhaled by one or other of these slowly rotting volumes. Discomfort in this pervasive and impalpable presence came on him more acutely than at any time that day. In an attempt to clear his throat of it, he choked, most unpleasantly. He hurriedly chose a Dickens from the second shelf as appropriate to a London fog, and had returned to the foot of the stairs when he decided that his reading tonight should by contrast be of blue Italian skies and white statues in beautiful rhythmic sentences. He went back for a Walter Pater. He found Marius the Epicurean tipped sideways across the gap left by his withdrawal of the old curiosity shop. It was a very wide gap to have been left by a single volume, for the books on that shelf had been closely wedged together. He put the Dickens back into it, and saw that there was still space for a large book. He said to himself in careful and precise words, "This is nonsense. No one can have possibly gone into the dining room and removed a book while I was crossing the hall. There must have been a gap before in the second shelf." But another part of his mind kept saying, in a hurried, mumbled torrent, "There was no gap on the second shelf. There was no gap on the second shelf." He snatched at both the Marius and the old curiosity shop, and went to his room in a haste that was unnecessary and absurd, since even if he believed in ghosts, which he did not, no one had the smallest reason for suspecting any of the modern Kensington house wherein he and his family had lived for the last 15 years. Reading was the best thing to calm the nerves, and Dickens a pleasant, wholesome, and robust author. Tonight, however, Dickens struck him in a different light. Beneath the author's sentimental pity for the weak and helpless, he could discern a revolting pleasure in cruelty and suffering, while the grotesque figures of the people in Cruikshank's illustrations revealed too clearly the hideous distortions of their souls. What had seemed humorous now appeared diabolic, and in disgust at these two favourites, he turned to Walter Pater for the repose and dignity of a classical spirit. But presently he wondered if this spirit were not in itself of a marble quality, frigid and lifeless, contrary to the purpose of nature. "I've often thought," he said to himself, "that there's something evil in the austere worship of beauty for its own sake." He had never thought so before, but he liked to think that this impulse of fancy was the result of mature consideration, and with this satisfaction he composed himself for sleep. He woke 2 or 3 times in the night, an unusual occurrence, but he was glad of it, for each time he had been dreaming horribly of these blameless Victorian works. Sprightly devils in whiskers and peg-top trousers tortured a lovely maiden, and leered in delight at her anguish. The gods and heroes of classical fable acted deeds whose naked crime and shame Mr. Corbet had never appreciated in Latin and Greek unscenes. When he had woken in a cold sweat from the spectacle of the ravished Philomel's torn and bleeding tongue, he decided there was nothing for it but to go down and get another book that would turn his thoughts in some more pleasant direction. But his increasing reluctance to do this found 100 excuses. The recollection of the gap in the shelf now occurred to him with a sense of unnatural importance. In the troubled dozes that followed, this gap between 2 books seemed the most hideous deformity, like a gap between the front teeth of some grinning monster. But in the clear daylight of the morning, Mr. Corbet came down to the pleasant dining-room, its sunny windows and smell of coffee and toast, and ate an undiminished breakfast, with a mind chiefly occupied in self-congratulation that the wind had blown the fog away in time for his Saturday game of golf. Whistling happily, he was pouring out his final cup of coffee, when his hand remained arrested in the act, as his glance, roving across the bookcase, noticed that there was now no gap at all in the second shelf. He asked who had been at the bookcase already, but neither of the girls had, nor Dicky, and Mrs. Corbet was not yet down. The maid never touched the books. They wanted to know what book he missed in it, which made him look foolish as he could not say. The things that disturb us at midnight are negligible at 9 a.m. I thought there was a gap in the second shelf, he said, but doesn't matter. There never is a gap in the second shelf, said little Jean brightly. You can take out lots of books from it, and when you go back the gap's always filled up. Haven't you noticed that? I have. Nora, the middle one in age, said Jean was always being silly. She had been found crying over the funny pictures in The Rose and the Ring, because she said all the people in them had such wicked faces, and the picture of a black cat had upset her, because she thought it was a witch. Mr. Corbet didn't like to think of such fancies for his Jeanie. She retaliated briskly by saying Dicky was just as bad, and he was a big boy. He had kicked a book across the room and said, "Filthy stuff," just like that. Jean was a good mimic. Her tone expressed a venom of disgust, and she made the gesture of dropping a book as though the very touch of it were loathsome. Dicky, who had been making violent signs at her, now told her she was a beastly little sneak, and he would never again take her for rides on the step of his bicycle. Mr. Corbet was disturbed. Unpleasant housemaids and bad school friends passed through his head as he gravely asked his son how he had got hold of this book. "Took it out of that bookcase, of course," said Dicky furiously. It turned out to be the boy's Gulliver's Travels that Granny had given him, and Dickie had at last to explain his rage with the devil who wrote it to show that men were worse than beasts and the human race a washout. A boy who never had good school reports had no right to be so morbidly sensitive as to penetrate to the underlying cynicism of Swift's delightful fable, and that, moreover, in the bright and carefully expurgated edition they bring out nowadays. Mr. Corbett could not say he had ever noticed the cynicism himself, though he knew from the critical books it must be there, and with some annoyance he advised his son to take out a nice, bright, modern boy's adventure story that couldn't depress anybody. It appeared, however, that Dickie was off reading just now, and the girls echoed this. Mr. Corbett soon found that he too was off reading. Every new book seemed to him weak, tasteless, and insipid, while his old and familiar books were depressing, or even in some obscure way, disgusting. Authors must all be filthy-minded. They probably wrote what they dared not express in their lives. Stevenson had said that literature was a morbid secretion. He read Stevenson again to discover this peculiar morbidity, and detected in his essays a self-pity masquerading as courage, and in Treasure Island an invalid's sickly attraction to brutality. This gave him a zest to find out what he disliked so much, and his taste for reading revived as he explored with relish the hidden infirmities of minds that had been valued by fools as great and noble. He saw Jane Austen and Charlotte Bronte as two unpleasant examples of spinsterhood, the one as a prying sub-acid busybody in everyone else's flirtations, the other as a raving, craving maenad seeking self-immolation on the altar of her frustrated passions. He compared Wordsworth's love of nature to the monstrous egoism of an ancient bellwether isolated from the flock. These powers of penetration astonished him. With a mind so acute and original, he should have achieved greatness, yet he was a mere solicitor, and not prosperous at that. If he had but the money, he might do something with those ivory shares, but it would be a pure gamble, and he had no luck. His natural envy of his wealthier acquaintances now mingled with a contempt for their stupidity that approached loathing. The digestion of his lunch in the city was ruined by meeting sentimental yet successful dotards whom he had once regarded as pleasant fellows. The very sight of them spoiled his game of golf, so that he came to prefer reading alone in the dining-room even on sunny afternoons. He discovered also, and with a slight shock, that Mrs. Corbett had always bored him. Dickie he began actively to dislike as an impudent blockhead, and the two girls were as insipidly alike as white mice. It was a relief when he abolished their tiresome habit of coming in to say good night. In the now unbroken silence and seclusion of the dining-room, he read with feverish haste, as though he was seeking for some clue to knowledge, some secret key to existence, which would quicken and inflame it, transform it from its present dull torpor to a life worthy of him and his powers. He even explored the few decaying remains of his uncle's theological library. Bored and baffled, he yet persisted, and had the occasional relief of an ugly woodcut of Adam and Eve with figures like bolsters and hairs like dahlias, or a map of the cosmos with Hellmouth in the corner, belching forth demons. One of these books had diagrams and symbols in the margin, which he took to be mathematical formulae of a kind he didn't know. He presently discovered that they were drawn, not printed, and that the book was in manuscript, in a very neat crabbed black writing that resembled black letter printing. It was, moreover, in Latin, a fact that gave Mr. Corbett a shock of unreasoning disappointment. For while examining the signs in the margin, he had been filled with an extraordinary exultation, as though he knew himself to be on the edge of a discovery that should alter his whole life. But he had forgotten his Latin. With a secret and guilty air, which would have looked absurd to anyone who knew his harmless purpose, he stole to the schoolroom for Dickie's Latin dictionary and grammar, and hurried back to the dining-room, where he tried to discover what the book was about with an anxious industry that surprised himself. There was no name in it, nor of the author. Several blank pages had been left at the end, and the writing ended at the bottom of a page with no flourish or superscription, as though the book had been left unfinished. From what sentences he could translate, it seemed to be a work on theology rather than mathematics. There were constant references to the master, to his wishes and injunctions, which appeared to be of a complicated kind. Mr. Corbet began by skipping these as mere accounts of ceremonial, but a word caught his eye as one unlikely to occur in such an account. He read this passage attentively, looking up each word in the dictionary, and could hardly believe the result of his translation. Clearly, he decided, this book must be by some early missionary. The passage I've just read, the account of some horrible rite practised by a savage tribe of devil-worshippers. Though he called it horrible, he reflected on it, committing each detail to memory. He then amused himself by copying the signs in the margin near it and trying to discover their significance. But a sensation of sickly cold came over him. His head swam, and he could hardly see the figures before his eyes. He suspected a sudden attack of influenza and went to ask his wife for medicine. They were all in the drawing-room, Mrs. Corbet helping Nora and Jean with a new game, Dickie playing the pianola, and Mike, the Irish terrier, who had lately deserted his accustomed place on the dining-room hearthrug, stretched by the fire. Mr. Corbet had an instant's impression of this peaceful and cheerful scene before his family turned towards him and asked in scared tones what was the matter. He thought how like sheep they looked and sounded. Nothing in his appearance in the mirror struck him as odd. It was their gaping faces that were unfamiliar. He then noticed the extraordinary behaviour of Mike, who had sprung from the hearthrug and was crouched in the furthest corner, uttering no sound, but with his eyes distended and foam round his bared teeth. Under Mr. Corbet's glance, he slunk towards the door, whimpering in a faint and abject manner, and then, as his master called him, he snarled horribly, and the hair bristled on the scruff of his neck. Dickie let him out, and they heard him scuffling at a frantic rate down the stairs to the kitchen, and then again and again a long-drawn howl. "What can be the matter with Mike?" asked Mrs. Corbet. Her question broke a silence that seemed to have lasted a long time. Jean began to cry. Mr. Corbet said irritably that he didn't know what the matter was with any of them. Then Nora asked, "What's that red mark on your face?" He looked again in the glass and could see nothing. "It's quite clear from here," said Dickie. "I can see the lines in the fingerprint." "Yes, that's what it is," said Mrs. Corbet in a brisk staccato voice. "The print of a finger on your forehead. Have you been writing in red ink?" Mr. Corbet precipitately left the room for his own, where he sent down a message that he was suffering from a headache and would have his dinner in bed. He wanted no one fussing around him. By next morning he was amazed at the fancies of influenza, for he had never felt so well in his life. No one commented on his looks at breakfast, so he concluded that the mark had disappeared. The old Latin book that he'd been translating on the previous night had been moved from the writing bureau, although Dickie's grammar and dictionary were still there. The second shelf was, as always in the daytime, closely packed. The book, he remembered, had been in the second shelf, but this time he didn't ask who'd put it back. That day he had an unexpected stroke of luck in a new client of the name of Crabbe, who entrusted him with large sums of money. Nor was he irritated by the sight of his more prosperous acquaintances, but with difficulty refrained from grinning in their faces. So confident was he that his remarkable ability must soon place him higher than any of them. At dinner he chaffed his family with what he felt to be the gaiety of a schoolboy, but on them it had a contrary effect, for they stared either at him in stupid astonishment or at their plates, depressed and nervous. Did they think him drunk, he wondered? And a fury came on him at their low and bestial suspicions and heavy dullness of mind. Why, he was younger than any of them. But in spite of this new alertness, he couldn't attend to the letters he should have written that evening, and drifted to the bookcase for a little light distraction, but found that for the first time there was nothing he wished to read. He pulled out a book from above his head at random and saw that it was the old Latin book in manuscript. As he turned over its stiff and yellow pages, he noticed with pleasure the smell of corruption that had first repelled him in these decaying volumes, a smell, he now thought, of ancient and secret knowledge. This idea of secrecy seemed to affect him personally, for on hearing a step in the hall, he hastily closed the book and put it back in its place. He went to the schoolroom where Dickie was doing his homework and told him he required his Latin grammar and dictionary again for an old law report. To his annoyance, he stammered and put his words awkwardly. He thought that the boy looked oddly at him and cursed him in his heart for a suspicious young devil, though of what he should be suspicious he couldn't say. Nevertheless, when back in the dining room, he listened at the door and then softly turned the lock before he opened the book on the writing bureau. The script in Latin seemed much clearer than on the previous evening, and he was able to read at random a passage relating to a trial of a German midwife in 1620 for the murder and dissection of 783 children. Even allowing for the opportunities afforded by her profession, the number appeared excessive. Nor could he discover any motive for the slaughter. He decided to translate the book from the beginning. It appeared to be an account of some secret society whose activities and rituals were of a nature so obscure, and when not, so vile and terrible, that Mr. Corbet could not at first believe that this could be a record of any human mind, although his deep interest in it should have convinced him that from his humanity at least it was not altogether alien. He read until far later than his usual hour for bed, and when at last he rose, it was with the book in his hands. To defer his parting with it, he stood, turning over the pages, until he reached the end of the writing, and was struck by a new peculiarity. The ink was much fresher and of a far poorer quality than the thick rusted ink in the bulk of the book. On close inspection, he would have said that it was of modern manufacture and written quite recently, were it not for the fact that it was in the same crabbed late 17th century handwriting. This, however, did not explain the perplexity, even dismay and fear he now felt as he stared at the last sentence. It ran, "Contine te in perennibus studiis," and he had at once recognized it as a Ciceronian tag that had been dinned into him at school. He couldn't understand now how he had failed to notice it yesterday. Then he remembered that the book had ended at the bottom of a page, but now, as the last two sentences were written at the very top of a page. However long he looked at them, he could come to no other conclusion than that they had been added since the previous evening. He now read the sentence before the last. Re imperfecta mortuus sum, and translated the whole as, I died with my purpose unachieved. Continue thou the never-ending studies. With his eyes still fixed upon it, Mr. Corbet replaced the book on the writing bureau and stepped back from it to the door, his hand outstretched behind him, groping and then tugging at the door handle. As the door failed to open, his breath came in a faint, hardly articulate scream. Then he remembered that he had himself locked it, and he fumbled with the key in frantic, ineffectual movements, until at last he opened it and banged it after him as he plunged backwards into the hall. For a moment he stood there, looking at the door handle. Then, with a stealthy, sneaking movement, his hand crept out towards it, touched it, began to turn it, when he suddenly pulled his hand away and went up to his bedroom 3 steps at a time. There he behaved in a manner only comparable with the way he had lost his head after losing his innocence when a schoolboy of 16. He hid his face in the pillow, he cried, he raved in meaningless words, repeating, "Never, never, never, I'll never do it again. Help me never to do it again." With the words, "Help me," he noticed what he was saying. They reminded him of other words, and he began to pray aloud. But the words sounded jumbled. They persisted in coming into his head in a reverse order, so that he found he was saying his prayers backwards. and at this final absurdity he suddenly began to laugh very loud. He sat up on the bed, delighted at this return to sanity, common sense and humour, when the door leading into Mrs. Corbett's room opened, and he saw his wife staring at him with a strange, grey, drawn face that made her seem like the terror-stricken ghost of her usually smug and placid self. "It's not burglars," he said irritably. "I've come to bed late, that's all, and I must have wakened you." "Henry," said Mrs. Corbett, and he noticed that she had not heard him. "Henry, didn't you hear it?" "What?" "That laugh." He was silent, an instinctive caution warning him to wait until she spoke again, and this she did, imploring him with her eyes to reassure her. It wasn't a human laugh. It was like the laugh of a devil." He checked his violent inclination to laugh again. It was wiser not to let her know that it was only his laughter she had heard. He told her to stop being fanciful, and Mrs. Corbett, gradually recovering her docility, returned to obey an impossible command, since she could not stop being what she had never been. The next morning, Mr. Corbett rose before any of the servants and crept down to the dining room. As before, the dictionary and grammar alone remained on the writing bureau. The book was back in the second shelf. He opened it at the end. 2 more lines had been added, carrying the writing down to the middle of the page. They ran, "Ex auro canceris indentem elepantis," which he translated as, "Out of the money of the crab into the tooth of the elephant." From this time on, his acquaintances in the city noticed a change in the mediocre, rather flabby and unenterprising old Corbett. His recent sour depression dropped from him. He seemed to have grown 20 years younger, strong, brisk and cheerful, and with a self-confidence in business that struck them as lunacy. They waited with not unpleasant excitement for the inevitable crash. But his every speculation, however wild and harebrained, turned out successful. He no longer avoided them, but went out of his way to display his consciousness of luck, daring and vigour, and to chaff them in a manner that began to make him actively disliked. This he welcomed with delight as a sign of others' envy and his superiority. He never stayed in town for dinners or theatres, for he was always now in a hurry to get home, where, as soon as he was sure of being undisturbed, he would take down the manuscript book from the second shelf of the dining room and turn to the last pages. Every morning he found that a few words had been added since the evening before, and always they formed, as he considered, injunctions to himself. These were at first only with regard to his money transactions, giving assurance to his boldest fancies, and since the brilliant and unforeseen success that had attended his gamble with Mr. Crabbe's money in African ivory, he followed all such advice unhesitatingly. But presently, interspersed with these commands were others of a meaningless, childish, yet revolting character, such as might be invented by a decadent imbecile, or, it must be admitted, by the idle fantasies of an ordinary man who permits his imagination to wander unbridled. Mr. Corbett was startled to recognise 1 or 2 such fancies of his own, which had occurred to him during his frequent boredom in church, and which he had not thought any other mind could conceive. He at first paid no attention to these directions, but found that his new speculations declined so rapidly that he became terrified not merely for his fortune, but for his reputation and even safety, since the money of various of his clients was involved. It was made clear to him that he must follow the commands in the book altogether or not at all, and he began to carry out their puerile and grotesque blasphemies with a contemptuous amusement, which, however, gradually changed to a sense of their monstrous significance. They became more capricious and difficult of execution, but he now never hesitated to obey blindly, urged by a fear that he could not understand, but knew only that it was not of mere financial failure. By now he understood the effect of this book on the others near it, and the reason that had impelled its mysterious agent to move the books into the second shelf so that all in turn should come under the influence of that ancient and secret knowledge. In respect to it, he encouraged his children with jeers at their stupidity to read more, but he could not observe that they ever now took a book from the dining-room bookcase. He himself no longer needed to read, but went to bed early and slept sound. The things that all his life he had longed to do when he should have enough money now seemed to him insipid. His most exciting pleasure was the smell and touch of these mouldering pages as he turned them to find the last message inscribed to him. One evening it was in 2 words only, Carnem Ocide. He laughed at this simple and pleasant request to kill the dog, for he bore Mike a grudge for his change from devotion to slinking aversion. Moreover, it could not have come more opportunely, since in turning out an old desk he had just discovered some packets of rat poison bought years ago and forgotten. No one therefore knew of its existence, and it would be easy to poison Mike without any further suspicion than that of a neighbour's carelessness. He whistled light-heartedly as he ran upstairs to rummage for the packets and returned to empty one in the dog's dish of water in the hall. That night the household was awakened by terrified screams proceeding from the stairs. Mr. Corbett was the first to hasten there, prompted by the instinctive caution that was always with him these days. He saw Jean in her nightdress scrambling up onto the landing on her hands and knees, clutching at anything that afforded support, and screaming in a choking, tearless, unnatural manner. He carried her to the room she shared with Nora, where they were quickly followed by Mrs. Corbett. Nothing coherent could be got from Jean. Nora said that she must have been having her old dream again. When her father demanded what this was, she said that Jean sometimes woke in the night crying because she had dreamed of a hand passing backwards and forwards over the dining-room bookcase until it found a certain book and took it out from the shelf. At this point, she was always so frightened that she woke up. On hearing this, Jean broke into fresh screams, and Mrs. Corbett would have no more explanations. Mr. Corbett went out onto the stairs to find what had brought the child there from her bed. On looking down into the lighted hall, he saw Mike's dish overturned. He went down to examine it and saw that the water he had poisoned must have been upset and absorbed by the rough doormat, which was quite wet. He went back to the little girl's room, told his wife that she was tired and must go to bed, and he would take his turn at comforting Jean. She was now much quieter. He took her on his knee, where at first she shrank from him. Mr. Corbett remembered with an angry sense of injury that she never now sat on his knee, and would have liked to pay her out for it by mocking and frightening her. But he had to coax her into telling him what he wanted, and with this object he soothed her, calling her by pet names that he thought he'd forgotten, telling her that nothing could hurt her now he was with her. At first his cleverness amused him. He chuckled softly when Jean buried her head in his dressing-gown. But presently an uncomfortable sensation came over him. He gripped at Jean as though for her protection, while he was so smoothly assuring her of his. With difficulty he listened to what he had at last induced her to tell him. She and Nora had kept Mike with them all the evening and taken him to sleep in their room for a treat. He had lain at the foot of Jean's bed, and they had all gone to sleep. Then Jean began her old dream of the hand moving over the books in the dining-room bookcase. But instead of taking out a book, it came across the dining room and out onto the stairs. It came up over the banisters and to the door of their room, and turned their door handle very softly and opened it. At this point she jumped up wide awake and turned on the light, calling to Nora. The door, which had been shut when they went to sleep, was wide open, and Mike was gone. She told Nora that she was sure something dreadful would happen to him if she did not go and bring him back, and ran down into the hall, where she saw him just about to drink from his dish. She called to him, and he looked up but did not come, so she ran to him and began to pull him along with her. when her nightdress was clutched from behind, and then she felt a hand seize her arm. She fell down and then clambered upstairs as fast as she could, screaming all the way. It was now clear to Mr. Corbett that Mike's dish must have been upset in the scuffle. She was again crying, but this time he felt himself unable to comfort her. He retired to his room, where he walked up and down in an agitation he couldn't understand, for he found his thoughts perpetually arguing on a point that had never troubled him before. "I'm not a bad man," he kept saying to himself. "I've never done anything actually wrong. My clients are none the worse for my speculations, only the better. Nor have I spent my new wealth on gross and sensual pleasures. These now have no attraction for me." Presently he added, "It's not wrong to try and kill a dog, an ill-tempered brute. It turned against me. It might have bitten Jeanie." He noticed that he had thought of her as Jeanie, which he had not done for some time. It must have been because he had called her that tonight. He must forbid her ever to leave her room at night. He couldn't have her meddling. It would be safer for him if she were not there at all. Again, that sick and cold sensation of fear swept over him. He seized the bedpost as though he were falling, and held on to it for some minutes. I was thinking of a boarding school," he told himself, and then, "I must go down and find out. He would not think what it was. He must find out. He opened his door and listened. The house was quiet. He crept onto the landing and along to Nora and Jean's door, where again he stood, listening. There was no sound, and at that he was again overcome with unreasonable terror. He imagined Jean lying very still in her bed, too still. He hastened away from the door, shuffling in his bedroom slippers along the passage and down the stairs. A bright fire still burned in the dining-room grate. A glance at the clock told him it was not yet 12. He stared at the bookcase. In the second shelf was a gap which had not been there when he had left. On the writing bureau lay a large open book. He knew that he must cross the room and see what was written in it. Then, as before, words that he did not intend came sobbing and crying to his lips, muttering, No, not that. Never, never, never. But he crossed the room and looked down at the book. As last time, the message was in only 2 words. Infantem occide. He slipped and fell forward against the bureau. His hands clutched at the book, lifted it as he recovered himself, and with his finger he traced out the words that had been written. The smell of corruption crept into his nostrils. He told himself that he was not a snivelling dotard, but a man stronger and wiser than his fellows, superior to the common emotions of humanity, who held in his hands the sources of ancient and secret power. He had known what the message would be. It was, after all, the only safe and logical thing to do. Jean had acquired dangerous knowledge. She was a spy, an antagonist. That she was so unconsciously that she was 8 years old, his youngest and favourite child, were sentimental appeals that could make no difference to a man of sane reasoning powers such as his own. Jean had sided with Mike against him. "All that are not with me are against me," he repeated softly. He would kill both dog and child with the white powder that no one knew to be in his possession. It would be quite safe. He laid down the book and went to the door. What he had to do, he would do quickly, for again that sensation of deadly cold was sweeping over him. He wished he had not to do it tonight. Last night it would have been easier, but tonight she had sat on his knee and made him afraid. He imagined her lying very still in her bed, too still. But it would be she who would lie there, not he, so why should he be afraid? He was protected by ancient and secret powers. He held on to the door handle, but his fingers seemed to have grown numb, for he could not turn it. He clung to it crouched and shivering, bending over it until he knelt on the ground, his head beneath the handle, which he still clutched with upraised hands. Suddenly the hands were loosened and flung outwards with the frantic gesture of a man falling from a great height, and he stumbled to his feet. He seized the book and threw it on the fire. A violent sensation of choking overcame him. He felt he was being strangled, as in a nightmare. He tried again and again to shriek aloud, but his breath would make no sound. His breath would not come at all. He fell backwards, heavily, down on the floor, where he lay, very still. In the morning, the maid who came to open the dining-room windows found her master dead. The sensation caused by this was scarcely so great in the city as that given by the simultaneous collapse of all Mr. Corbett's recent speculations. It was instantly assumed that he must have had previous knowledge of this and so committed suicide. The stumbling block to this theory was that the medical report defined the cause of Mr. Corbett's death as strangulation of the windpipe by the pressure of a hand, which had left the marks of its fingers on his throat. If you like that story, consider supporting me as a patron. That way you help me make more stories for you and get access to a patrons-only library of stories. Lots more hours for you to listen to. There's a lot to be said this week, so I need to try not to wander too much. Let me tell you about Margaret Irwin, the author of this story. You've just heard the book. So Margaret Emma Faith Irwin was born on 27th of March 1889 in Highgate, London. Her father was Andrew Clark Irwin. He was originally from Perth, Western Australia, and her mother was Anna Julia Irwin nee Baker, daughter of Colonel George Baker of the 16th Queen's Lancers. She lost parents in her early childhood and was raised by her uncle Sidney Thomas Irwin, who was a master of classics at Clifton College in Bristol, I might say. She received her education at Clifton High School and later attended Oxford University, where she earned a degree in English. So some of the early women authors went to Oxford at a time when they weren't allowed to have degrees, but she clearly did. She decided to be a writer quite early in 1920, so she's only, how old is she? 31, so she's not a baby. She was published both novels and short stories, and in 1929 she married John Robert Monsell, a children's author and illustrator who designed covers for some of her books. She became the authority on Elizabethan and early Stuart periods and wrote a lot of historical novels. Her most celebrated works include Queen Elizabeth, the trilogy, Young Bess, Elizabeth Captive Princess, and Elizabeth and the Prince of Spain. Young Bess was adapted into a film in 1953, starring Gene Simmons. Now, Sheila's reading loads of books at the moment by Philippa Gregory, and she wrote so many books about that period, and they're apparently really, really good, but I said I wouldn't wander too much, so I'm going to try not to talk about that. The windows are open because it's really hot in here with all the computers and everything, so there's lots of dogs and nonsense going. Anyway, let me tell you about her, Margaret Irwin, a bit more about her. So she was meticulous. She wrote these Tudor and Stuart books, lots of them, but she also wrote fantasy and supernatural fiction. She wrote fantasy novels, Still She Wished for Company in 1924 and These Mortals, and they delve into themes of time travel and fairy tales. Now, what we know her for are her ghost stories, the earlier service. She did a book called Bloodstock, which I've got, and an anthology, and earlier services in that, and I've done it on the site, and this one is the book which was recommended to me. She died in December 1967. They're carrying on. I don't know why. These aren't my dogs, by the way. They're just random dogs from outside. So let's talk about the book specifically. First published in 1930 and later featured in the December 5th, 1951 issue of Famous Fantastic Mysteries. It was then anthologized in Madame Fears the Dark 1935 and Bloodstock and Other Stories 1953, which is what I've got. I think I've got a 1953 edition, to be fair. What's to be said about it, really? So we know the story. It is a familiar tale. I actually, let me give you my visceral response to it. I thought there was a bit in it I thought, this is very unpleasant. Not her writing, but this man, I thought, thank goodness he didn't kill the dog. But the fact that he's considering killing the dog and then his daughter. So I thought she did it really well, this kind of possession by an evil book. And we've done and there's a disembodied hand in it. And we've done, of course, The Beast with Five Fingers and The Ghost of a Hand by Sheridan Le Fanu and stuff. So there's a whole bunch of stories about monster hands. But this is really... Do I want to say this? Yeah. So he's possessed by this evil book. And that's it, really. And the how it works really well is it's really nasty. And you're like, oh. And she does it. I mean, I think the temptation might have been either to make it comic or to tone it down a bit. But the fact that this guy is actively considering murdering his daughter and his dog is, and just done in such a naturalistic way. It's not naturalistic, but as if it's like a commonplace for him. Yeah, why not? It's a logical thing to do. I think she did that really well. And there was times I thought, that was exactly what I thought. That noise. Oh, anyway, really what I want to talk about as a vehicle from that book, the story as a vehicle, the book, is this tome called The Tome of Eldritch Law. It's a trope. No, tome. Trope called The Tome of Eldritch Law. I got my tome and my trope mixed up. So if you are interested in this kind of thing, there's a site called TV Tropes, and it looks at all the tropes, which are to say repeated themes, objects, scenarios that are used time and time again in stories, whether that be on TV, whether that be in films, whether that be in literature. And this, although it tends towards the pop culture, it does discuss literature as well. So let's look at this, and we see this turning up time and time again, this idea of an ancient book which is evil. Yeah, it can have a personality. I'm going to jump slightly sideways. If you think how Peter Jackson, more than Tolkien actually, if Peter Jackson portrayed the ring explicitly in his Lord of the Rings films, it was in a sense a similar thing. It was an object that was evil and corrupting. And I suppose one of the essences of evil, I had a discussion with my therapist years ago about what the essence of evil is, and to me, evil in our tradition is something that's wholly selfish and seeks itself above the wishes of others. So it's the greatest sin is to be selfish and walk all over other people. She, however, thought the essence of evil was the power to corrupt, which is actually quite a you think of sort of Christian ideas, Milton and the whole satanic thing. Actually, in things like The Exorcist, what's his name? Blatty's book, The Exorcist, another great book. Actually, a great book, a really good read. And yeah, it's not just the thing itself is evil, but contact with it makes other people evil. And that's what we're seeing here. Now, the corruption of evil is a theme. I want to kind of just put that on the table and leave it for a bit and talk specifically about the Tome of Eldritch Law. Okay, what are its characteristics? It recurs time and time again. So, first of all, it's of arcane provenance. So, it's of uncertain or ancient origin. Tick. Written in dead, or you might say Czech, written in dead or obscure languages such as Latin, Sumerian, or invented magical alphabets. Hey, here we are again. Czech. Tick check. Its physical appearance tends to reflect decay or otherness. Absolutely, it's decayed. It smells mouldering. Yeah, so it's very interesting. I'm sure that Margaret Irwin didn't sit and think, well, she didn't have access to the internet, so she didn't go on TV tropes and go, oh yeah, what I'm going to do a book about, I want to use this trope. Oh yeah, it's got to look like this. It's got to be mouldy. It's got to be written in Latin. Latin's got to be of unexplained origin. Its alien quality implies a knowledge that lies beyond the sphere of human understanding. Again, we've got it. It contains forbidden or prohibited knowledge. Both of those are the same thing, really. And it typically comprises cosmological revelations of knowledge that people aren't supposed to have, magical formulae, and magical formulae are to do with power. There's a whole theological issue here that actually is in Islam as well, and probably in Judaism as well, Abrahamic idea that we should not You know, this whole idea, if you go and talk to the Hindus and they say, oh, you are God, and the Abrahamic believers go, no way, we're going to kill you for saying that, and because, you know, we should not, as humans under Christianity and Judaism or in Islam, we should not take unto ourselves the power of the Creator, whereas the Chinese, the Indian view, and lots of indigenous views that I don't know about, are that isn't an issue. You know, that isn't a big thing, but it is a big thing in the Abrahamic tradition. I think this idea of the eldritch tome is absolutely rooted in Christianity, but also within, because Christianity arises from, you know, the books, the book, the people of the book, etc. So, forbidden knowledge. Also, of course, the Greeks have that with Prometheus, whereby Prometheus and Icarus, of course, went too high, and hubris in Greek myth is punished as well. So maybe it's not completely Abrahamic. It's a recurring thing in human thought anyway. So again, a key point about those who access this forbidden knowledge are transformed into obsession, misanthropy. Absolutely, he hates people, or madness, and their moral compass is compromised, reflecting on this corruption of evil that is in the book. So in a sense, this eldritch law is a subclass of the corruption of evil. We'll come to why it might be evil in a minute. So we've got, so far, it's exactly in this story, isn't it? Also, these books, and I referred to the ring, didn't I? The One Ring in Tolkien, a transformation of the ring, a quasi-sentient agency. In some cases, they resist destruction. Think of the ring. Influence nearby texts or minds. Well, it actually did do that. It corrupted all those other nice books, didn't it? And it was infecting his children and exhibit a will of their own. Absolutely. So this is bang on for her book here. This is interesting here. The trope often reflects a crisis of epistemology, rationalism, enlightenment values, and domestic order are destabilized by the intrusion of this forbidden text. It questions the legitimacy and safety of literary knowledge itself. Yeah, to an extent. But in this story, it absolutely threatens the domestic order. It destroys his family, really. And it also challenges him as a enlightenment rationalist with a small r. So he doesn't think about the fact he is swimming in environment, in enlightenment rationalism, you know, this idea of materialism and stuff and progress and the world can be understood. The whole idea of rationalism is the world is understandable if we just persist long enough. So you see the physicists today, they have this great faith in these big problems of dark matter and whatever, the unifying all the different forces, gravity and the electrical force and the weak force and all this, and the hard problem of consciousness. They will just, if we give them enough time, they will solve it, because fundamental to materialism is this belief that this universe is understandable by the human mind, right? That's a key, probably the key thing of rationalism. If we move away from that, the other view is that it isn't. And I often talk about the romantic stroke Gothic mind versus the rationalist mind, the religious mind versus the scientific mind, if you like, whereby the scientific mind, being rationalist, believes that ultimately everything will be understood, and the religious mind that says we cannot understand, you know, and we shouldn't try to understand. Get where I'm going with this. And this, let's talk about the literary antecedents, because there's a bunch of those. Now, the classic, where this, if we were to come to this trope anew as we are, we would think of Lovecraft, wouldn't we? And we'd think of his book, The Necronomicon, which first appears in the story The Hound, which I've done on the channel, 1924. And if you, again, I often talk about the game Call of Cthulhu, which is a role-playing game developed from Lovecraft's work. And they have a sanity, it's unique in role-playing games, and they have a sanity rule whereby if you access more and more of this knowledge, these revelations, through books or through closeness to the forbidden, that you go insane. You become evil, but you're probably going to go insane first. That's Lovecraft. That is very much in the tradition of this trope, which we've seen I'm not even sure that Margaret Irwin, although this story came out just after The Hound. So say it comes out in 1930, The Hound has been published in 1924. It's possible she read it. I'm not sure that this is where we get it from. I did a story about William Croft Dickinson about an evil book, and in fact I talk in that thing. There was not too far from where I live, there was a castle in the medieval times called Wolsey Castle, and it was actually belonged to a monastery and of Home Cultram, a priory, I think, possibly. And on it was supposed to be the grimoire, the eldritch tome of the wizard Michael Scott, who was a Scottish wizard who was given to all sorts of miracles and suspected of, and this is relevant, of being in league with the devil. And this according to local folklore, this book was so evil it was kept on an iron peg and nobody went near it. It's been lost since, so obviously they weren't that careful about it. Maybe got burned. But, you know, so this idea of the eldritch tome actually goes back much further than Lovecraft. Even further than the guy I'm going to mention next, which is Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. He's Faust, very famous, but written in two parts. One when he was young, in 1808, and part two, which he wrote, which is much more esoteric, he wrote in 1832. And so the character of Heinrich Faust is this studious dude, and he's got everything, theology, philosophy, medicine and law, and he's empty, and what he turns to is a book of magic, and this promises knowledge beyond reason and faith, a route to unfolding the inner fortunes of nature. So this is a potentially subtle point. Maybe it isn't as subtle as I think, and you'll go, of course, that's obvious. But to me, it always seemed quite subtle. How one of the shared impulse of science, we've already talked about rationality, which is about understanding, is about power. It's power through understanding. If we only understood and we could model the world, we could predict it, we could control it. That's what science and technology, that's the absolutely raison d'etre. Magicians are the same. This other non-scientific impulse to control the world through knowledge of its hidden secrets, i.e. magic. Think of Isaac Newton, who was an alchemist, and the alchemists were very closely tied to the Renaissance maguses, you know, the Renaissance magicians, who I'm going to be talking about them again in the shortly. But you know, it's the same impulse. The magician, the scientist, are operating from this same desire to understand and control, but one is doing it through open reason, empirical observation. The other is doing it through occult forces. We'll come to what occult means. So, and so you see in Faust is the scientist, isn't he? He's a scientist. He's a Renaissance scientist, but he's also a magician as well, because it's from the same place. So he invokes the earth spirit by reading of magic symbols. And I won't give any spoilers, but Faust is good. You should go and read it. I found two better than one. And they say twos are always worse, but you know, and I thought Faust 2 was better. So then we have in Matthew Lewis's The Monk, 1796. So this idea of the tome is integral to Gothic fiction. And of course, the ghost story and the horror story are children of Gothic fiction. So Matthew Lewis wrote The Monk in 1796, and there's magical texts which facilitate demonic contact and moral collapse. That's really important that they're both together. This is how it's... See, I'm guessing the actual magicians didn't... If they just thought the two things, if I access this magical tome, I will collapse morally. I don't think they thought that. Often they prayed when they were doing it, and they would invoke angels and all sorts of stuff. So I think this idea of if you read this stuff, you're gonna go mad. You're gonna become evil and go mad. Actually, it doesn't originate in the scientist maguses themselves, but comes from the church, to be honest. Which will, you know, so. And Gothic stuff. Gothic literature wasn't massively thoughtful. It didn't kind of explore, in some cases potentially, but mostly it just took stuff. So the church says, if we read these evil books, we will be damned. Yeah, we'll have that. We'll have that lock, stock and barrel. Not like the actual maguses who were like, yeah, I'm not sure about what the church says. I'm going to try myself. Anyway, so... And then, of course, the other person that we think about with this, the occult tomes, we've talked about Goethe, we've talked about Lovecraft, we've got Margaret Irwin, I've talked about, what's his name, Croft Dickinson, but is M.R. James, of course. And so we have Canon Alberich's scrapbook, 1895. The volume contains an image so hideous that it acts as a conduit for demonic presence. We have the tractate Midoff in 1911. A hidden theological manuscript becomes the focal point of ghostly vengeance and contested inheritance. James doesn't explain any of this stuff, as Irwin doesn't. Remember, the key thing of the tome is its origins are obscure. I mean, I suppose Lovecraft talks about how the Necronomicon was a translation into Arabic. No, it was originally a Greek book that the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred translates into Arabic. And, he's clever at these, sketching how these books, then the provenance of the books. But, so we have a number of stories that M.R. James specifically uses, books. I want to talk about what we see in James is that this eldritch tome, remember, the theme is the corruption of forbidden knowledge, how it is evil and how it corrupts. And typically, books hold knowledge, but as we talk about the Tolkien's Ring, it isn't just books. It can be any object. So, of course, in James, this corrupting thing that is mysterious and ancient and evil can be a whistle, I'll come to you, or an inscribed crown, a warning to the curious. Done both of those on the podcast if you want to go and listen to them. And also, the key thing in James is, if you are too curious, you will be punished. So again, this is kind of repeating the orthodox church view that certain knowledge is prohibited, and if you, in your arrogance, go seeking it out, evil forces will destroy you. And we have this in this book, of course. We have it in the book by Margaret Irwin. But M.R. James is absolutely about that. And I'm not sure that and this is, the descent from Gothic literature. They're not questioning this. This is what's been given by their culture, and if you seek forbidden knowledge, you'll be punished. There's no questioning this. Now, when we look at the origin of this, we look at the reality of medieval and Renaissance Europe, where the church is both guardian and gatekeeper of doctrinal truth. So those who sought out occult texts or occult knowledge, hermetic treatises, which could have come from the Greeks, the grimoires, the alchemical works, did so in secret, because if they were caught by the church pursuing hidden knowledge, they would be excommunicated, imprisoned, or executed. So we have people like Giordano Bruno, Pico della Mirandola, and John Dee. They have to cloak their writings in allegory, secrecy, and appeals to divine inspiration. So to occult is Latin for to hide. That's what the whole word means. It is hidden. So they had to. They couldn't stop their curiosity. The church said, don't go after this stuff. And they were like, yeah, but I just want to know. And the church says, you'll come to no good, mainly because we'll kill you. So they had to hide it. Hence, it is a cult. Okay. So, why does the church... So the church keeps knowledge to itself. Look at old Dan Brown's... his very famous book. Do you know how you get mental blanks? It's the absolutely famousest book about the Jesus having been married, not the Blood and the Holy Grail, which he stole it from, but Holy Blood and Holy Grail, which I read first, which he stole it from. But that's this idea that the church, we don't trust them because hidden in the Vatican archives are all sorts of stuff, and so there is this conspiracy theory thing that says we don't trust authority. They're hiding something. I'm not going to say, but there is a thing you say about, what journalists tend to say about politicians. When you meet a politician and he tells you something, you say, why is this lying bastard lying? Why is this lying bastard lying to me about this particular thing? So the church keeps this. People who wanted to seek outside this were punished, so they had to hide it. So the church said, or the church came to this view in the Renaissance period, in the Enlightenment period. It was like, right, okay, because it's basically a flood door opened. People wanted to know, and they were going to go out and know, and the church probably thought, well, we can't control it all. So I'll tell you what we'll say. Anything spiritual is ours. Anything natural, so if you want to count frogs or count planets, well, that can be dodgy when you start straying into ideas of creation, or fossils. If you want to just do any of that, you can do that. And you can be philosophers, rational philosophers, think about that. You can be natural philosophers and go out and count things. But that's all you can do. You look at the material, and we'll look at the spiritual. And we will kill you if you step out of line on this. This is the boundary. So the scientists, whole of Western science took this on board and said, right, okay, we're going to just focus on material, which led to this immense split in the Western psyche, whereby we end up with this materialist technological viewpoint, which is divorced from the spiritual, and has been, because the church said spiritual is what you do on Sunday. You can count frogs or strata or measure how long it takes for bowling balls to fall down in your spare time, but on Sunday you come to us. And so this whole materialist spiritual split can be seen as originating in that Enlightenment period when the church closely controlled. So rationalist philosophers, Locke, Kant, they were not allowed to look at metaphysical issues. I mean, you could argue Kant does. Well, they do, but mainly don't do it. All right. So why? I've already alluded to this at the beginning. So if we look at, is it Genesis 3:5, which of course is in Jewish tradition as well, in the Talmud, I think. I don't know as much as I should about Judaism. There's the Garden of Eden, and there's Adam and Eve, and God says, you can now do what you like here. See that tree over there? That knowledge of good and evil? Do not eat from that or you'll die. That's exactly what the church is saying much later, isn't it? Do not go after this knowledge. It's not for you. It's mine. You don't have it. Anyway, the serpent comes along and he says to them, Eritis sicut Dei, scientes bonum et malum. You will be as gods. You will know good and evil. Yeah? And this is the great disobedience that introduces sin. So the great first sin is this transgression by going after prohibited knowledge. That God has said, this is mine, not yours. There are things you're not to know, and you'll be punished if you try. So, and of course in Deuteronomy 18:12, practices such as sorcery and divination, which is closely related. Divination is when you go and have your tarot cards read, or you look at your chart, and you're trying to know things that aren't for you to know. It isn't for you to know the future. This is God's knowledge. If you try and know it, you're sinning, because you're stepping over that boundary of the things He's told you. This isn't for you. And I say He's told you, I mean the church has told you. The church through the scriptures and its authority has told you this. So when you do that, and the sorcery is actually when you're trying to use hidden knowledge or knowledge that shouldn't be yours to manipulate. You're trying to control the future. It isn't for you to control the future. You are here to be subject to divine will. Free will, yeah, you can make choices within, but don't try and get too clever. Don't try and control things. Don't try and use magic knowledge that is not yours to try and control things. Okay, so this is the great sin. Now, looking at this is clearly in Christianity. If we look at Islam, engaging with sorcerers or soothsayers is strictly forbidden, because it arises also from the Abrahamic tradition. If you look at Judaism, is far more interesting in this, because there are prohibitions against certain magical practices. Deuteronomy, we've just seen that, but there is such a thing as the Kabbalah in Judaism. Now, what it says is, under Judaism, no necromancy, no sorcery, no divination. They're all condemned in the Torah. There is this mystical exploration of the world and everything about, all the worlds behind the world. So this starts coming out in between 100 and 500 C Common Era. So as the Haichalot and the Merkava, and then it becomes systemized in 12th century Provence, and then the Zohar, the great foundational book of Kabbalah, is written in the late 13th century in Castile in Spain by Moses de Leon, who lived from 1240 to 1305, although he attributes it to earlier stuff. So the Kabbalah delves into the hidden structure of the divine world, the 10 Sephirot, the emanations of God, and the metaphysical processes underlying creation. So it's basically dodgy, isn't it? It's bordering on this magical knowledge. I think the thing, you must be over 40 to study it, and you must be well versed in the Torah and Talmud, otherwise you're not allowed to study it. And then you have, from the 16th century onward, Lurianic Kabbalah in Safed, and then Hasidic Judaism from the 18th century, and Kabbalistic ideas began to filter more widely into Jewish spirituality. They also come into the Western Christian tradition, and they feed into, so basically the Western Hermetic tradition is a kind of a hodgepodge of Judaistic Kabbalah, some Greek and Roman stuff, a little bit of Egyptian, whatever they've kind of cobbled together, and increasingly sort of Indian and Chinese stuff as well. So because it's worth saying that all the time that the occult was hidden in the West, it still went on. And we know this. There was a tradition of people studying magic, alchemy, and things like that. And they took a lot, particularly in Victorian times, they took a lot from the Kabbalah, which, interestingly, for an Abrahamic religion, wasn't prohibited. I mean, it was circumscribed, but it wasn't prohibited. So, and then we get like the 60s and 70s, and there is a further breakdown in the authority of the Western Church. Probably the Western Church. Well, I don't know, maybe the Eastern Church is one. I'm thinking of Gurdjieff and people like that. But primarily the Western. So because of this split I've talked about in Enlightenment, whereby the spiritual was not allowed, the only spiritual stuff you got on Sundays and from your Bible reading, and that was it. And so as the authority of the Western Church begins to fail in the 60s and 70s, it may be renewing itself, but at that period there, many people in the West sought spiritual traditions, and a number of them went back to this hidden Western tradition, and therefore you get the growth of things like Wicca and all sorts of stuff. I think LaVey and Satanism are slightly different. I think they're different. But, this return to the Hermetic, because, I mean, Wicca was founded by Gerald Gardner, and Aleister Crowley wrote the Book of Shadows that he puts out as Wicca. Aleister Crowley was well versed in Victorian magic, which is Kabbalah, which is a bit of Egyptian, a bit of Enochian, a bit of all sorts of stuff. So you see what I'm saying? But my final point in this is a number of other Western people would look east to India and China, primarily India. But when you look at this, so the Indians never prohibited this kind of thought. So this split between the rational and the spiritual doesn't happen in India. They're rationalistic. They approach things like Advaita. They approach. And then Buddhism, which arises from there's all sorts of esoteric Buddhism, and of course in China, all Taoism and things like that. Lots of esoteric alchemical practices, and Qigong and things like this idea of forces. This was never prohibited, and so a lot of Western people in the 70s turned towards the East. Others turned towards the hidden occult, but in the West that had kept on going. Others, as I'm saying, I think I've said this like 17,000 times already, repeating myself or what. But that's my point, okay? So to wind this up, what we said is this story is a well-done example. Margaret Irwin's The Book is a well-done example of a trope which we see in Lovecraft, in Goethe, in all sorts of places, in M.R. James, of the occult book that contains forbidden knowledge. And then we looked at why is this knowledge forbidden, and we see this idea in the Abrahamic traditions that certain knowledge, going right back to the Genesis story, is for God only, and by descent from God the churches. It belongs to the church. It is not for people to look into on their own, and it is prohibited, and they will be punished for doing this. And the story was, the reason it is prohibited isn't just because we want to keep all the knowledge ourselves. It is because it's bad for you. And I guess there is some truth in this. There's some genuine concern from the priesthood, the Christian priesthood, that to go beyond God's... God's told you quite straight, right in Genesis, if you overstep that and you try to take the powers of God to yourself, either by trying to know the future or to manipulate the world through these powers, you are communing, you're breaking God's law, and that it's like if you start getting in bad ways, taking drugs, riding motorbikes, hanging out with louche people, you probably end up coming in trouble with the police, won't you? Because you're that. And I think that's the thing. If you start doing any of these things, you're gonna mix with wicked forces that God's trying to protect you from. That's the whole reason. The whole issue is, why would God, who is ultimately good, why would he say, don't mess with this knowledge? Is it because he's just arrogant and greedy? Well, I guess the magicians would say that. Some of the people who rebelled against that would say, yeah, that's exactly. Think of Paradise Lost. Yeah, that's exactly it. He's just a bit too big for his boots, God. He wants to keep all the good things for himself, not for us. But we think we deserve them. That's the view. Whereas the other view is, no, he's doing it for your own good, because there's bad stuff there. Yeah. So I think this story, the book by Margaret Irwin, on cue, actually takes that message and delivers it to us. Yes, don't seek for this bad knowledge, because it'll mess you up.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked drawer today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret of the dead come back?